at any time, and I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. So whenever the topic of how Congress can do a better job comes up, I often think about my weekly or mostly weekly experience at the airport, where I unfortunately spend a lot of my time. After I go through security, I immediately get a text from CLEAR, which is our expedited airport security service, asking me how they did. And I can give positive or negative feedback instantaneously, and they can use that information to figure out pain points and improve services. So Congress doesn't have anything like that, but perhaps it should. Any member will, of course, tell you that we get plenty of constituent feedback in the form of phone calls and emails and social media posts. Our job as representatives is to give voice to our constituents, and we need to hear from them in order to effectively represent their views in the policymaking process. This form of feedback is an important and necessary feature of representative democracy, but I'm talking about a different kind of feedback. In addition to representing the views of our constituents, our offices also help them navigate the federal bureaucracy. We facilitate constituent requests to executive branch agencies, we assist in scheduling tours of various government buildings, and we help them secure official documents and flags flown over the Capitol building. These are really important services, and we have no idea if we're doing a good job providing them. So often this work involves sending constituent requests onto another entity, and then depending on that entity to follow through. Tracking requests can be incredibly difficult, if not impossible in some cases, and privacy protection rules can make it tough for us to follow up with federal agencies and get additional information that might assist our constituents in getting a simple status update. This is an area where I think feedback, as well as systems for tracking requests and detecting common patterns, would be immensely helpful. For example, we might learn from constituent feedback that a particular agency's response time is unusually slow. Tracking systems might show us where requests are getting held up, and those systems might also help us detect patterns in the number of requests we're getting related to a particular government program. This kind of data can inform Congress's oversight activities and help us get ahead of problems before they do real damage. These kinds of customer feedback loops are pretty standard in pretty much every business, and there's a reason for that. They help companies improve their customer service, which then improves customer trust in the business. We know that Congress isn't a business, but it does work for the American people, and when it comes to the services our offices provide, constituent feedback can help us do a better job. The American people expect competent customer service, and I think we owe it to our constituents to meet, if not exceed, that standard. So, the good news is that technology solutions exist, and today we are going to hear from some experts who've thought a lot about how Congress can take advantage of feedback and tracking systems that are standard across the private sector. The committee will use its rules that allow for a more flexible hearing format that encourages discussion and the civil exchange of ideas and opinions. Here comes the good wonky part. In accordance with Clause 2J of House Rule 11, we will allow up to 30 minutes of extended questioning per witness, and without objection, time will not be strictly segregated between the witnesses, which will allow for extended back and forth exchanges between members and the witnesses. Vice Chair Timmons and I will manage the time to ensure that every member has equal opportunity to participate. Additionally, members who wish to claim their individual 5 minutes to question each witness pursuant to Clause 2J2 of Rule 11 will be permitted to do so following the period of extended questioning. I feel like I really nailed that. So with that, I'd like to now invite Vice Chair Timmons to share some opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by thanking our witnesses for joining us today. Your combined years of public service and your ongoing work to improve the effectiveness and responsiveness of government will surely provide unique and helpful perspectives from which we can draw on evaluating Congress's own performance and identifying areas for improvement. I'm very excited for today's hearing on improving constituent services and opportunities to make Congress a more customer-friendly and helpful institution. It is often said that this is a people business. More accurately, it's a service business. I cannot tell you how rewarding it is to deliver top-rate constituent services to the people of my district. It is one of the best parts of this job, helping people get something from the federal government that they are owed, whether it was during the pandemic with PPP loans and COVID relief, or veterans benefits, Medicare, you name it. We deliver the best customer service possible, and we love doing it. And if each office can improve just a little bit because of this hearing, excuse me, it will have a huge impact on the American people. And more importantly, as the chairman referenced, if we can get better feedback on what are the difficult parts of the federal government that are coming up short across the country, we can improve processes, and we can use those processes to make the whole system better. So we're going to really make some progress in this hearing, and I cannot wait to hear your recommendations. Again, I'm sorry I'm not there. I wish I was. Looking forward to be back with you all next week. But Mr. Chairman, look forward to this hearing. Thank you so much. Thank you to witnesses, and I'll yield back.
Terrific. I'd now like to welcome our three witnesses who are here to share with us their experiences in working to make Congress a more responsive institution. Witnesses are reminded that your written statements will be made part of the record. Our first witness is Ann Meeker. Ms. Meeker is Director of Strategic Initiatives at PopVox Foundation, a nonpartisan platform for civic engagement tools. Prior to this, she was the Technology, Science, and Data Project Manager for PopVox. Ms. Meeker previously served as the Director of Constituent Services for Congressman Seth Moulton and managed the Technology, Science, and Data Orientation session at the U.S. House of Representatives New Member Orientation for the class of 2020. Ms. Meeker, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Kilmer, Vice Chair Timmons, members of the Select Committee and staff, thank you for holding today's hearing on constituent services and for your continued hard work to make Congress more resilient. I had the privilege of serving as a Director of Constituent Services for the office of Congressman Seth Moulton until December of 2019. Working with constituents of the Massachusetts 6th as part of that team was one of the greatest honors of my life. I would also like to say I have been a longtime Taxpayer Advocate Service fangirl, and I've spent the last few years professionally bothering Matt Lira in my current role as Director of Strategic Initiatives for the PopVox Foundation, so it is an enormous honor to appear with them today. One of the things that has stayed with me from my work as a caseworker is how many constituents facing incredible challenges had the grace to ask how their experience could be used to prevent similar problems from happening for others. For me, answering that question is at the heart of building a more constituent-friendly Congress, and in that spirit, it is my privilege to offer 4 recommendations today. First, the Chief Administrative Officer should establish Housewide unified analytics to identify and monitor casework trends. Every day, congressional offices receive rich input directly from constituents attempting to access vital services and information from federal agencies. These cases often illustrate bottlenecks or lack of clarity in language or procedures and can be a valuable source of insight for committee oversight or legislative action. However, Congress does not take advantage of this information because this data is siloed across 541 individual offices. To make that data usable, this committee should consider recommending that the House Chief Administrative Officer work with caseworkers to develop a case tagging system that better captures the details of individual cases, require technology vendors to incorporate the new tagging system into approved casework software, and developed an opt-in advanced programming interface, or API, allowing offices to share anonymized case data to a central repository. Aggregated casework data could allow support agencies, committees of jurisdiction, and individual offices to track casework trends and identify emerging problem areas. These statistics can also help lawmakers identify regional or state-specific problems and help new offices understand their district's needs. For constituents, this would mean a more effective casework system overall and the reassurance that Congress is learning from their individual experiences. Second, expanded contact information for relevant agency staff. So in our office, we spent an enormous amount of time tracking agency contacts beyond CRS's basic liaison list and had horror stories of casework inquiries lost in abandoned inboxes. Finding correct agency contact information is also one of the most significant challenges for new offices. To address this challenge, this committee could recommend that CRS maintain an updated contact list of agency liaisons, including field office staff, processing center staff, ombuds or advocate staff, and other contacts as appropriate for each agency. Third, expand opportunities for caseworkers to share best practices, including through in-person professional development. One case that has always stayed with me was a retired middle school math teacher who came to our team when her Social Security retirement benefits were suddenly and dramatically reduced due to the windfall elimination provision. When we could not help her reach a favorable resolution, we worked with our local Code for America brigade to create a benefit calculator that we hoped would help other constituents affected by this provision avoid the same surprise. Casework teams around the country develop their own innovations to help constituents, but these innovations often remain limited to one district because there's no way for offices to share their work. I would encourage this committee to recommend that CAO expand the online training and information hub associated with its new coaching program to allow casework teams to share their own case studies and resources, giving all offices access to the institutional knowledge required for good casework. I also want to emphasize the importance of in-person training and networking opportunities. Providing a way for caseworkers to form relationships and learn from colleagues benefits all offices, especially because casework topics often transcend partisan divides and open pathways for bipartisan collaboration. Lastly, expand support services for district and casework staff. While seeing the courage and the selflessness and the resilience of ordinary Americans through casework is uniquely rewarding, casework is also uniquely taxing. Caseloads remain far above pre-pandemic averages, and constituent interactions are increasingly mistrustful and combative. Recent issues like the pandemic and the Afghanistan withdrawal have also challenged casework teams' capacities like never before. Caseworker burnout impacts Congress's ability to serve constituents, and I encourage this committee to recommend the House Office of Employee Assistance consider a series of site visits to district offices to understand the current working environment for casework and assess whether additional support resources are warranted. My written testimony contains further details on each of these recommendations. Thank you again for your attention to this important topic, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Meeker. And our next witness is Nina Olson. Ms. Olson is the executive director and founder of the Center for Taxpayer Rights. From 2001 to 2019, she served as the National Taxpayer Advocate of the United States, whose office assists taxpayers in resolving their problems with the IRS and in making administrative and legislative recommendations to mitigate systemic problems. Ms. Olson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Timmons, and members of the Select Committee. Thank you for inviting me today to speak about the Congressional Affairs Program of the Taxpayer Advocate Service, or TAS, and the constituent services it provides to local and Washington, D.C. congressional offices. The first prong of TAS's statutory mission is to help taxpayers solve their problems with the IRS. This is the focus of TAS's case advocacy function. To deliver that mission, Congress required the National Taxpayer Advocate, or NTA, to establish at least one local office in every state. Today, TAS has 75 local offices, including the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. Each office is headed by a local taxpayer advocate, or LTA, and staffed with case advocates who work on taxpayer cases. Case advocates maintain an inventory, that is, they own their caseload. Every case advocate has their own toll-free line extension, so taxpayers have a free way to get directly in touch with their case advocate. To get a case accepted into TAS, taxpayers have to experience significant hardship, which is defined as a significant privation or imminent threat of harm or adverse impact or a delay over and above normal processing times. TAS assistance is available to all taxpayers, individuals, small and medium businesses, large entities, nonprofit entities, even municipalities, states, and tribal governments. Between 2001 and 2019, TAS received over 4 million cases. For each of those cases, TAS assigned at least one issue code describing what was involved in the case, for example, an earned income credit audit, or a request for a federal tax lien release, or a frozen tax refund flagged for identity theft. With over 100 issue codes available, TAS cases paint a clear picture of where taxpayers are struggling and where IRS procedures seem to be confusing or deficient. The Congressional Affairs Program grows out of TAS's geographic approach to its casework. TAS's local offices are responsible for working all case-related issues that congressional offices send to the IRS. Every congressional district and state are assigned to one local taxpayer advocate office. In this way, relationships and trust between the LTA, case advocates, and local congressional staff build up over time. The importance of congressional cases is reaffirmed by the requirement that all correspondence with a congressional office must be signed by the LTA. It cannot be delegated. LTAs are required to visit each congressional local office at least once each year. When local congressional offices hire new staff, the LTAs are required to reach out to the staff and explain how best to interact with TAS. The hundreds of thousands of cases TAS receives each year are a goldmine of data with which to identify systemic problems, problems that are affecting not just the specific taxpayer involved in the case, but a group of taxpayers or all taxpayers. TAS staff analyze TAS case data to identify trends in IRS program areas and identify whether problems are occurring at a local, regional, or national level. TAS constituent case data also helps TAS advocate internally for improvement to IRS procedures and employee guidance. In this way, through TAS pre-decisional advocacy, it can prevent problems from occurring or recurring, thereby minimizing burden and harm to constituents. By requiring the NTA to issue 2 reports to Congress annually, Congress gave the NTA a very important vehicle with which to independently raise her uncensored concerns about taxpayer problems and directly make administrative and legislative recommendations to Congress. The reports are grounded in both the case and systemic advocacy work that TAS does every day. The annual Congressional Affairs Program Conference, held in February each year, completes the cycle of TAS's systemic advocacy and constituent service. Prior to the conference, LTAs contact the members of Congress aligned with their offices and schedule meetings with members or staff. During these visits, LTAs are able to share their firsthand experiences, the results of their casework originating from that office, and thereby bringing TAS's recommendations close to home. After their congressional visits, they share their comments. They would share their comments with me and expressions of interest from the members, and I could follow up with the members or staff. These visits often resulted in legislation being introduced. So I just thank you today for the opportunity to share with you my perspective on constituent service provided by the Office of the Taxpayer Advocate, and I look forward to working with your committee on this matter so critical to improving the operation of government and establishing trust. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. And last but not least, we are joined by Matt Lira, who is a partner at Hanger Capital. Prior to that, he most recently served as Special Assistant to the President for Innovation and Policy Initiatives during the Trump administration. Mr. Lira has had a unique career working in the political, government, and private sectors to improve digital platforms to make a smarter, more efficient, and more effective government. He's also served as a senior advisor to House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and as a Deputy Executive Director of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Mr. Lira, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chair Timmons, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding today's hearing and for inviting me to discuss this important topic. We all know the feeling, what it's like to be delighted by a customer interaction. Review any list of the most popular, most trusted, and often the most successful brands in the United States, and you will see a list of organizations that treat their stakeholders well. Throughout every touch point, in ways both large and small, the user experience is prioritized. It's more than a mere luxury. It's a feeling of respect, it's a feeling of being valued, and it creates trust. At the core, this is what constituent service is all about. Delivering a modern approach for constituent services has the potential to reinvigorate the legislative process, streamline casework requests, and rebuild the public's trust in their national civic institutions. In my discussions with members and staff, there has rarely been resistance to the idea of modernization in principle. In fact, it is an idea that is typically met with enthusiastic support. However, in practice, implementation efforts are often inhibited by capacity limitations within their offices. To confront this reality, the House should prioritize improvements that unlock the ability to improve not just a single constituent service, but the overall capacity to improve all constituent services. These can be outlined across 3 broad categories: ensuring executive sponsorship, enhancing Housewide capabilities, and expanding the capacity of individual member offices. Towards that end, I recommend the following initial steps be taken. 1, the House should designate and empower a senior official with responsibility for coordinating improvements to Housewide capabilities in constituent experience. In support, each House officer should designate a point person for improving constituent services impacted by their agency. For most Americans, the only direct interaction they will have with their elected representatives is via constituent services. Yet institutional responsibility for the baseline quality of those experiences is somewhat amorphous. While there are several dedicated public servants who care about this issue working in the House and doing phenomenal work, these concerns are typically only one aspect of a broader portfolio, rather than their primary focus and responsibility. 2, the House should publish a core set of secure, standards-compliant application programming interfaces, or APIs, for the most common constituent services provided by House offices. Similar in this respect to the Communicating with Congress service, these constituent service APIs would enable approved developers and vendors to use their expertise to improve the constituent experiences provided by the House. 3, the House should leverage existing commercial technologies that will remove the extensive inefficiencies that have long faced the daily operations of individual member offices, particularly those which are currently handled by entry-level and junior staff. Time, energy, and resources spent performing repetitive, manual processes can be shifted to higher value work. There is perhaps no greater opportunity for rapidly expanding the ability of every member office to improve their engagement with their constituents. Ultimately, however, the House should do more than streamline existing processes. It should incorporate modern technology into the overall congressional workflow. In this single week, Congress is expected to consider 26 separate pieces of legislation, conduct 14 hearings, and host countless engagements on a full range of topics. Each event is important to certain constituencies. Yet most of those same constituencies will never know they occurred. In this regard, Congress is often like a student who completes their homework, yet neglects to actually turn it in. This is more than the communication challenge it is often confused to be. It reflects a fundamental disconnect between congressional capabilities and the public's expectations. Over a half-century ago, faced with the rapid emergence of television, the House embraced new technology and fully incorporated television into its routines. Congress did more than simply add an easel to the corner of a room or allow individual member offices to experiment with the camera. The House floor and committee hearing rooms, including the one we are sitting in today, received stage lighting, control booths, becoming elaborate television studios in effect. These capabilities were more than vanity. They enabled the Congress to succeed in an era dominated by television. Today, it is once again critical that Congress, as an institution, modernize its capabilities to meet the public's expectations in a digital world. Every day, somewhat quietly in the background, thousands of constituent actions or interactions are happening throughout congressional offices. How many of those interactions have delighted people? How many of those have made people feel heard by their government? How many have created trust? I commend the committee for hosting this important discussion. I have more extensive recommendations in my written statement, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks very much. I now recognize myself and Vice Chair Timmons to begin a period of extended questioning of the witnesses, and any member who wishes to speak should just signal their request to either me or Vice Chair Timmons. So, Mr. Lira, I kind of want to start where you ended. It seems like there's the capacity for technology to improve the engagement of members of Congress with their constituents. So I think in your written testimony, you mentioned the analogy of Congress being like a student who completes their homework and then forgets to turn it in. That's, to me, a great description of the disconnect that exists between congressional offices and constituents. Congress actually does some of this important work that our constituents care about, but we hear from our constituents that they don't know about it. So just as an example, a constituent may write in about a topic about which they care passionately, and they may get a response letter at that time. But then if something actually happens to that bill, it passes the House, or maybe we have a system where eventually we figure out a 499 or something like that in response. But it seems like technology exists that would enable something to happen more directly and immediately to address a constituent's concern. How hard would that be?
Well, thank you, Chair. That's a fantastic question. I think, so you nailed, I think, the essential point, which is that the people are expressing proactively their interest in a given issue, oftentimes in a specific piece of legislation. And yet, they get the response, the generic form letter. Maybe in some offices it's fast, in some offices it's a little slower, but it ultimately doesn't keep up with the work that Congress is actually doing. So from a technological perspective, it's actually quite easy to build platforms which would enable even automated responses and updates to say, well, if someone has written in about, I'll make it easy, like HR 1, that they receive updates on their preferred method of communication, which may not be a letter, could be a text message or a social update, that, oh, HR 1 has moved through committee. HR 1 has passed the House, HR 1 has become law. And the reason, if you were to task an individual office with doing that with today's capabilities, it would be daunting.
Yeah.
Because it would be a manual process and people are underwater just keeping their head afloat with all the inbound communication. But this is, again, where the technology plays a critical role. By automating not only that capability, but other capabilities that they're currently spending manual work hours on, it enables that kind of communication to happen programmatically. I think historically, there have been member offices that have experimented with these kinds of approaches on an individual level, some of which with a certain measure of success. But the challenge is, and again, I draw the analogy back to television, 50 to 70 years ago, the expectation that an individual member office with their level of resource should build this infrastructure, I think, is unrealistic. This needs to be something that's provided by the entirety of the House to all offices, so that they can all be positioned to provide these sorts of updates. One other extension on that, if you'll indulge me, is in addition to, I think, providing updates as to what Congress is doing is the baseline. And that once you're able to do that programmatically, you actually unlock the ability to do true, authentic engagement on top of that. So if someone writes in a letter about HR 1, and it's in a committee, that you'd have the opportunity as a member to have a live stream Q&A session or a teletown hall about that specific bill with people who've expressed interest, with constituents who've expressed specific interest about that legislation. And again, I view this as an area of tremendous opportunity for the House.
I do too. Let me stick on this theme of how we might use technology better. And Ms. Meeker, I wanted to get a sense from you, and you touched on this in your testimony. Right now, the technology tools that are used by congressional offices are mostly focused on incoming and outgoing correspondence, but are also used for casework. Are there tools available that are better suited to intaking and tracking and processing casework? And beyond that, I could not agree with you more about the importance of, as we get casework, as we do casework, aggregating some of that information and identifying problems that are consistent across member offices. Is there a way to do that now? Is there any way with the tools that are in place now to use anonymized data for constituent management system and address some of these concerns? So those are my two questions.
Sure. So to take those questions in order, so as you mentioned, the current constituent relationship management platforms are not necessarily custom built for casework. I will say I'm aware that there are other software platforms that are built more for analogous interactions. Like I know that there is technology available for like social work interactions and medical interactions that may be closer analogies to casework. I haven't personally used them, so I can't speak to how effective they are or how much they would translate into a congressional office. To your question on whether it's possible to gather and use casework data right now, I think individual offices are doing that. So in our office, we did develop a more extensive system of case tagging that was incredibly helpful for our team for assigning case portfolios, for tracking trends at the district level. But as far as using it on a national scale, to my knowledge, there's no way to do that right now. And there are kind of two things that are in the way there. The first is that, as I said, each office tags differently. And most offices develop tags that go above and beyond the ones that come standard with CRMs. But that means that each office develops a different set of tags that aren't analogous and can't be transferred between offices right now. And then, as you say, there's no way to bring all of those together. There's no way to just bring them all into one aggregate data set.
Yeah. Let me invite Vice Chair Timmons to weigh in with questions.
Thanks, Chairman. I want to build on what we just finished on. Matt, you were talking about APIs. That's essentially what we're talking about here, trying to get the data aggregated and then anonymized so we can learn from it. Is that what you were referencing in your opening?
Yes, sir. To a certain degree, inclusive of that, I'd go beyond that one specific task, but I think that's one element of it. I think when you think of the Privacy Act implications or the the constituent relationship realities of members trying to retain ownership over that. The way that I like to think about it is rather than bring data to questions, I bring questions to data. And so the data can remain within the repository of the member office and under the member's control, and therefore respect the confidences of their constituents, but you're still able to do the broad scale analysis that Ann referenced through APIs. I would go further with APIs to say I think that APIs can be used for all constituent services, not only casework data, but yes, there's the potential there.
Do you know of any state, local, or foreign government that is doing this effectively?
Don't know of any state and local, though I'm sure they're out there by sheer numbers. Internationally, I mean, everyone speaks of Estonia, but I think of the United Kingdom. They've been able to leverage APIs to connect their legacy back-end infrastructure, which is often out of date, to enable modern front-end user experiences. I was in discussion with the United Kingdom in my previous role, and they have fairly good front-end user experiences for the Parliament. And I was asking, well, how do you do this? And how did you shift to new servers? And how did you get to the cloud? And sort of all these mammoth technology migration tasks. And they're like, oh yeah, we still have to do that. We haven't done that yet. But we've been able to use APIs to make sure that our constituents are having a modern experience. So they're prioritizing the end user experience even as they pursue back-end technology.
Sure. One more question. Speaking of improving services overall, as you recall, Congress passed the Creating Advanced Streamlined Electronic Services for Constituents Act, which is a great name, the Cases Act. And I guess my question is, theoretically, we should be fully transitioned to digital signatures and it should be somewhat mandated. I guess it doesn't seem like that's the case. Could you talk about, Matt, could you talk about the implementation of the Cases Act, how it was designed to improve services and whether it has been implemented universally or whether we still need to work on that?
Yes, sir. That's a fantastic question. First of all, I'll say as a former staffer, I always appreciate a great acronym for any piece of legislation. So cases is on that list. So cases I think is critically important. You have I believe it was inspired by disaster response where people whose homes had just been destroyed were waiting to get a wet signature before they could get disaster process underway. So it's a fantastic legislation. Congress did its job. OMB has issued its guidance to do implementation, but the agency implementation is varied. That while some agencies have moved forward on cases, not all agencies, including some A-level high-impact service providers, the 26 or so agencies that provide the most touch-point services out there, have yet to do it. And for me, it's a question of prioritization. The legislation passed in 2019. We then went into the crisis era. But as we come out of that era, I think it's important for Congress to reiterate that that is a priority for agencies to do their migration and ensure that it happens. It would be an enormous benefit for constituents. And again, if you go for, it may not be the top problem facing an agency's internal operation. It may not be the top problem facing the average congressional office, but it is one of the top problems facing constituents. And so if you use a user-first mindset, it should be one of the top priorities to update.
So would you say this is bureaucratic resistance? Do we need to change laws? What can we do to push this forward?
So given that Cases Act itself provides the statutory authority and I believe the mandate to do it, I don't believe it's a question of statutory authorization. My experience with agencies would indicate that there are excuses and there are reasons. And so if they're giving you the need for a statutory change to implement this, particularly when other agencies have already done it, I would file that under the category of an excuse and something that Congress should provide oversight energy against. If there's an authentic reason, and I suspect the reasons will look like budget levels and just general priorities for their authorization, then again that lends itself to oversight to say, well, we appreciate that the agency has different priorities, but the Congress has established this as the priority, and it should therefore move its way up the agency's priority list. So I really, to be succinct, think it's an oversight issue. Some of your fellow committees have had scorecards, I think of the Megabyte Act in the sort of the similar vein of updating its back-end technology system, and it dragged for years before it was implemented until, in this case, House Oversight established a simple report card as to whether or not an agency had done it or not, and within a year, all agencies were in compliance. So I believe some sort of oversight vehicle would be appropriate.
Sure. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
If I might add something, I think that every agency has an inspector general, and one thing you could ask the inspector generals to do is to, report on the conformity of the agency with the, mandates of the act. I think that that would give you data and even uncover, some of the reasons why the agency, or the excuses, as you say, may or may not be complying, or what are the barriers are, and that would be good information to receive.
Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think you'll all agree that Congress is an institution that has somewhat of a singular mission to legislate and serve, but yet it's an institution in competition with itself. So as you reflect on the notion of sharing best practices, which is integral, I think, to this conversation, how should we look at creating incentives to share information? Because, of course, right now the culture is to protect it. It's a competitive advantage. Even within delegations and within caucuses and conferences, I think it's fair to say. So certainly you, Ms. Meeker, based on your experience, give us a sense of what you think it would take to inspire and reward sharing best practices.
Sure, it's a fantastic question. And I will just say from my experience as a caseworker, I was always really surprised and heartened by how much collaboration there was among caseworkers. If anything, I think the collaboration was kind of stalled because there weren't good avenues for caseworkers to connect and share those best practices. There's a listserv and with no permanent archive that makes it very difficult to share resources in a way that's long-term and lasting. But as far as encouraging collaboration, I think every office wants to be known as the innovator, the office that has the best ideas, the best new ideas, the best tools, the best experiments to serve their constituents. I think recognizing some of the work that individual offices put in to innovate, to try new things, to impress their constituents with how much work and time and effort they put into constituent services would go a long way. And it wouldn't need to be a huge accolade, but I think the CAO, recognizing, hey, here are this month's top 5 innovative practices for casework would be something that I think would go a surprising way toward moving the needle on encouraging collaboration.
I love that notion. Mr. Lira, any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, sir. So I think of Senator Hickenlooper, or now Senator Hickenlooper, when he was governor, he said something along the lines of, there's no intellectual property for good ideas in public policy. I think I love that. So if Governor A comes up with something, then the Governor B should shamelessly steal that idea.
Exactly.
And so building that culture of, shamelessly stealing or being inspired by fellow offices, I think would be helpful. To Ann's point, I think that the spirit is there when you talk to a lot of caseworkers, but even beyond that at the staff level, there just isn't as much, the pathways for that collaboration are not institutional, and so they're often ad hoc. A well-motivated member or a well-motivated staffer will pull a group together in an ad hoc way, and then it will do some good, and then eventually they will move on to another role, or the member will move on to other priorities, and then it sort of falls apart. And so institutionalizing that collaboration, I think, would be helpful. And to your point on competition, I actually feel that healthy competition I've found to be one of the most effective ways to drive change inside the House of Representatives.
Sure.
Members can be known to being somewhat competitive with one another in a healthy way, staff as well. And so, I think of like the WHIP organizations in the respective conference and caucus and others have hosted these sorts of competitions in the conference and the caucus themselves. And it'd be interesting if the institution were to take on some of that, not in a way that would make any one office look bad, but in a way that can celebrate those that are doing good. I think, to build on Ann's point, would be really helpful. And again, make competition work for change rather than inhibit it.
So as simple as just creating space and place to share and inspire, and it makes me think, Mr. Chair, about the notion of like Shark Tank. Whether it's offices sharing what they're doing for some kind of a reward, and correspondingly to invite outside entrepreneurs to share ideas with us and have a competition and adopt best practices. Ms. Olson, the conversation prompts me to wonder what the responsibility of agencies are in this question. We are liaisons. We can't solve the problem typically. We are simply the brokers between frustrated constituents who can't get answers from the IRS or the SSA or the VA. So, in your testimony, you recommended that constituents would benefit from having similar advocates at the SSA and VA. Why do you think this hasn't occurred yet? It's considering how fundamental it is.
I've talked to some folks that are advocates for Social Security disability folks and veterans, and I think that some of it is maybe that when conversations about creating such an entity would come up, these agencies view themselves as providing service to their beneficiaries. And they may feel like that's a judgment on them that they're not doing enough.
Sure.
On the other hand, there are external groups whose jobs it is, to support those beneficiaries, all of the veterans groups, and they may view it as saying also, you're not doing your job well. And I think it just hasn't been explained that an internal advocate complements those responsibilities, those groups. It doesn't replace them, substitute for them. I think a very interesting statistic in the Taxpayer Advocate Service caseload is that about 35% of the cases, actually the taxpayers are represented by an attorney or a CPA. It's because that professional has gotten stuck, or some real harm is going to happen and speed is required and somebody to cut through the internal bureaucracy. And I think if it's explained in that way, it may be viewed differently, but those conversations really haven't happened yet.
Okay. Do any of you disagree with my contention that Congress should enhance its role and responsibility to provide oversight to the various agencies and ensure that they provide better customer service, if you will? Does anybody disagree?
No.
With that, Mr. Chair, I rest my case.
All right, Mr. Lira.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses today. I tell you, some of your testimony, not directed to you, but what you have in there hit raw nerves with me because of the work that we do. Just kind of background, I'm one of these that I've got to see everything that's going on in my office. I sign every constituent letter that goes out. I get a monthly report as to every department that we have worked with. Every county that we're having an issue in. And then with the ledger letters, I read every letter before they go out because I think it's important for me to know. But because there's a lot of work and not enough time and not enough staff. But if I could just start, and because it's things that really hit nerves. Ms. Meeker, nothing on you, but what you stated when you were working on WEP. I've been working on that since I've gotten here. This is my 8th term. I have had the IRS in my office saying that they need to put in a statement in large print when they send out their notices every year or month or whatever they send it out to a individual taxpayer, that if they are in a dual system like the state of Ohio that has 5 different systems for the state employees, that at the end you're going to get your Social Security reduced. And so, because again, in your testimony you talk about, what your work and how, you had to reach out to them. But I guess my thing is how do we get to these people beforehand to let them know that before they go from one system to another, they better make a hard decision on that, because in the end, it's going to affect them in their retirement. So I'm just curious. And I'm not picking on you right off the bat, but I tell you, some of your testimony today hit raw nerves of what we're working on all the time. But this is something since 2007 I've been involved with. I've been involved, even though I'm on Energy and Commerce, working with the folks on Ways and Means. But I'm just curious, how can we get that information out to taxpayers early on in their careers, that we don't hear it? I just had courthouse conferences through my counties during the 4th of July work period, and it came up again. People have it. This is something that's happening all the time. But I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely, and I certainly hear you on that raw nerve. Those cases were some of, as I mentioned, some of the ones that stayed with me, because it was the feeling for the constituent of surprise, of that I could have made this decision and no one told me I had to, is brutal. It's I think one of the most alienating experiences from your own government that you can have is that feeling of just awful surprise, and of information not being provided timely. So I mentioned some of the things that we did in our district to try to get the word out early, including building that calculator that helps people accurately predict their benefits. But I think stepping back for a second and thinking about it in a big picture, I think one of the things that may come out of professionalizing the contacts between caseworkers and agencies, I would hope, would be a more proactive partnership between agencies and caseworkers. As Nina mentioned, one of the unusual things about TAS is having a local accessible field office. And Congress has local accessible field offices. So what I would love to see would be a more professional working relationship that solves cases faster between caseworkers and agencies, but then also more of a two-way street, also more of agencies partnering with congressional offices to give proactive information, to say, hey, our policy is changing, here's how you can help get the word out, or here's how we can tap into your local knowledge and your local expertise, your networks of county councils and local retirement advocates to help people make that decision. I'd love to see Congress kind of take more of a service-minded approach to communication and proactive constituent services in that way.
Okay, well, thank you. Ms. Olson, again, on your testimony, especially what you do, here's something, especially with all, not just picking on IRS, but with all agencies and departments. This is one of the things that when we get involved in these cases, that I've said, why does it take a member of Congress to have to contact an agency or department to do a job for a constituent that they need to be doing? And again, we reach out to the taxpayer advocates all the time because, again, when I look at our caseload right now, it had been veterans, but after what's happened in the last 2 years, the massive part of our caseload runs right back into IRS. And so, how do we? Because I found it interesting in your testimony. You said, moreover. As IRS relies more and more on the historical data to train its models, filters, and artificial intelligence algorithms, TAS case data should be used to train AI models to overcome historical bias. Could you explain that?
So in our cases, we had, in general, when I was there, about a 70% relief rate. Sometimes in some issues it was 80. 1 year for identity theft, it was 90%, meaning that the taxpayer had tried to solve their problem with the IRS before coming to us, and it wasn't resolved. And in 90% of those cases, when they came to us, we got the relief the taxpayer was asking for. And so, in an audit, for example, if we have a 60% relief rate and the IRS is using its case data to program a computer to select cases for future audits, if you don't plug in our case data that showed you selected the wrong person for audit, in 60% of the cases that came to us, we got a different result. You should plug that information into the machine to see whether there are any trends, any pieces of information about our cases that would inform the machine it could learn from and not select that wrong person the next time. And, I've been after the IRS about that for years to do that because we're sitting there with 4 million cases, that they could really learn from our results and our, and our experience.
Not to interrupt, why isn't IRS listening to you? Because you're the ones out there that are actually talking to people.
I know.
And so I'm just curious, why aren't they listening?
Well, I'd say since I've been outside the IRS and fussing at people there, I've had better conversations about this, partly because people are more focusing on artificial intelligence and they're asking those questions. I think there's just a culture in the IRS that it just has so much work that it's easier to just continue doing the work the way you've been doing than take a step back and look at how you could maybe improve it. That's partly what the job of the Taxpayer Advocate Service was inside the IRS, was to constantly be there at the table saying, take that step back. And we'd have successes, but it's a big organization and it takes a lot to do.
Well, it sounds to me like it's an act of Congress.
Yeah.
If I could ask, you've been very kind in indulging me here, Mr. Chairman. One other, Mr. Lira, that also, you brought up about the inefficiencies, again, for our staffs and our offices, because again, we got a lot of work, we don't have enough people to get this done. But I'm just kind of curious again, to just hear again, what's the best way that, staff can get as much work done? Because again, we are talking all the time as to making sure we're not reinventing the wheel. And I've always said this, imitation is the greatest form of flattery. And so if somebody's doing something great, let's do it, and let's find out from other offices. But again, how do we get making sure that, I know you're talking about WIP and everything else, but we want to make sure that everyone's operating efficiently, because our biggest enemy is time, and we don't have the staff to be able to get it done. So it's important that we don't have burnout.
Thank you, Congressman. That's a fantastic question. I think when I think about the average individual member office, you kind of break down the working hours of that office. It's almost as like a pyramid, if you'll forgive the analogy. And there's some of the best opportunities are at these entry-level and junior positions, because even though they are not as high up on the org chart, they possess so many of the working hours that could feed into more capabilities for the overall office. And so most of the inefficiencies in the average member office, in my experience, are things to be endured. So it is, if you're an intern or you're, an LC and you pay your dues and then you come out of it and now I don't have to worry about that anymore. And now I can focus on, other things. And maybe I oversee these processes, but the inefficiency is no longer my problem. And this is not true of all member offices by any stretch of the imagination, but prioritizing solving for the inefficiency of these entry-level and junior offices, again, I'm talking as an institution here, I think possesses enormous opportunities. So to be specific, I think when you break down the workload by tasks, and what are those tasks which are manual and repetitive? Because whether it's robotic process automation or machine learning, the software exists to automate those tasks today without losing any semblance of the accuracy and enabling the shift from low value to high value work. And so in so doing, let's say you conceptually that you free up 1 working hour a week for 10 people. Well, that's 10 working hours a week. And that's a very conservative estimate about what RPA or other technologies could do. And so identifying topics of letters or sorting is this casework, is this a issue request, is this a tour request? These sorts of manual repetitive tasks could, again, unlock a lot of working hours, which not only enhances the capability of the office, but to the tail end of your question, I think could deal with recruitment and retention issues as well, as everyone wants to do that higher value work. It's a convenient truth, so I'll say it, but your office is known to be one of the more innovative offices, has been since my time on the Hill. So I don't know how much of that applies to the Team LATA, but it's certainly an opportunity for Congress as an institution, I think, writ large.
Well, one of the things, and I'm very, very proud of our staff, but also the interns we have in the office. And I was just finished with this. When the interns come in, they come back the next day and say, "Oh, good, they came back." But I don't think we've ever had one quit. But they do a great job. But thanks very much for your testimony. I really appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. Thanks very much for your indulgence.
You bet. All right, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. This is one of the most significant issues I think that we deal with, or maybe that we do not deal with, and that is customer constituent relations. And so it goes back to some of the most basic things, because people don't expect government to work. I think we've created that, albeit unintentionally, but our people just believe that no matter what happens, that they're not going to get an answer, that they're going to get put on hold, no matter what happens to them. Maya Angelou said, "People will never forget. People will forget what you say. People will forget even what you do, but they'll never forget how you made them feel." And so I think that there's a good way to even say, we can't help you. But and so because of that, I'm sitting here thinking, Mr. Chairman, that we don't. I'm not sure that there's any training for people who work on this Hill to respond to constituents. They're good people, and they want to do, but they don't. There's nothing. It's not their fault. They come in, we give them orientation in our office, and there's your desk. So I'm not criticizing members because I think the pace here is hectic, but that's even more reason that we ought to deal with that. Or do you agree that maybe we could better respond if we knew how to respond to make people feel that we were responding? Am I drunk?
If I may, overseeing the case advocates, their day is they get yelled at by taxpayers who are frustrated. Then they turn to IRS employees to do something, and they get yelled at by IRS employees who don't want to, and are just busy and don't want to hear from them. And we really early on realized the emotional toll that took, and asking our case advocates to be empathetic, with the taxpayers that they were talking to was a heavy lift if we didn't give them the tools. And we really had tried to develop training. Now, I happen to think that that is an endless process. You cannot ever stop doing training and recognizing the burden and the need to have downtime and time to just regroup and not constantly be on the phone and carve that in. And we also really tried to do training for our employees to really think about the taxpayers' side, how they were feeling. And so we would do role plays, literally, where one of the employees would be the taxpayer and would have to navigate, a bureaucracy, just to remind themselves of what it felt like, so that when somebody was yelling at you, you could learn to diffuse the situation. And there are tools for diffusing. I'm also reminded when I ran my low-income taxpayer clinic before I became the taxpayer advocate, I had a student intern, and I was listening to him do intake. And I was in my office listening to him for 5 minutes. He had this taxpayer who just wanted to rant. And I could hear this person just try to control him and get him off onto, well, what is the real issue? And of course, it took 5 minutes. And I said to him after the call, I said, you need to give taxpayers 5 minutes to rant and then get them down to business, because they're going to keep coming back to that rant if you don't let them rant. They have to say it because it's about their feelings, and then you can get them down to business. They're tools.
If I can jump in as well, I definitely agree. And there isn't a standard manual that someone hands you when you become a caseworker. There's no one standard. Congratulations, you're a caseworker now. Please attend this training at 9 a.m. on Tuesday. Caseworkers do an amazing job with ad hoc resources, and a lot of them are catch as catch can. Some external organizations offer caseworker resources and training. I know the Congressional Staff Academy has some wonderful classes now that were not available when I started. I'm a little bit jealous. But just to kind of put a finer point on the problem there, casework is high stakes. I mean, everything that Congress does is high stakes, of course, but if for an untrained caseworker, if you make a mistake not knowing what the rules are, if you make a mistake that harms a constituent, that reflects on the member. So I'd absolutely just double click on that point that the training is really vital and necessary, and it's not standard.
Yeah, if I may add, I think a process either respects someone or it doesn't. And by the time someone has called their member of Congress about a casework concern in particular, that's very rarely the first call they've ever made. So they're typically calling or writing an email from a point of desperation, from a point of feeling disrespected. And so that only increases the need for Congress to be that much better at handling those requests, because they're starting in deficit with the person's feelings towards their government as a whole. However, those are the moments when meeting those standards can actually reshape someone's perspective the most dramatically. To borrow a crude analogy, when you're feeling disrespected at the airport, but then the gate agent actually makes it better, you actually start to love the airline. And so that's, in my view, that safety valve is where Congress can uniquely play a role. Say, look, you wouldn't have come to your congressional office unless you felt disrespected or ignored or something's not working. But now that you're here, let's be that person that makes you understand why government, and particularly representative government, plays such a valuable role for you as an end constituent.
Now, I wonder how difficult it would be for us, for us to think a bit more deeply about what happens when we hire people and how little preparation they have. My paranoia says that members say, hey, we don't have time for that. We're on 3 committees and they're meeting at the same time, and we got people calling on the phone. We need people to respond, and I know there's no simple answer, but I think this may be one of the most significant issues that our committee could deal with because of what I've heard all 3 of you saying about people are angry. And I think a lot of people make calls to us anticipating a negative response. They're going to send me to the water department, and I wish there was a way we could get it get this, incorporated into this system, when you get hired. I mean, and one of you said, it's not a program, it's a culture, so we'd have to, it should be something going all the time. And I don't know how, you guys are smart, so you probably can figure it out before we have the adjournment, but I think that it is critically important. I can't tell you how many people talk to me, probably all of us, but, I called IRS, and they put me on hold, and I got a voice, and voice was not human. So I think it's an important subject, and I also think we ought to figure out how to respond to it, just because during these times, it may be more important than ever. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I may.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're exactly right. And I think when most staff come in, if there's any training at all, it's either for people who've opted into it because they're kind of go-getters, and so therefore it's not everybody, or they just mimic the culture of the office that they got hired into. And which works great when things are going great, but the problem is, especially with technological change, and I think it's a unique opportunity for this committee in particular, to say, well, if we're going to drive cultural change in offices and teach them the new way forward, then starting with people literally on their first day, and how does orientation work to help them reimagine how their offices then operate, and as the other witnesses have indicated, continuing with that throughout their career as staff, and then ultimately, for members as well. But even chiefs of staff, will say that when you would talk to them about changing a system, or let's change the way that correspondence is done, this is a mammoth task. And so they often will say, well, I don't know if it's the right fit for our office because, we've got enough, things to do. And so really prioritizing that training to show people how it can be done, I think would add a lot of value.
Yeah, we ought. I'm through, but we ought to. We probably need some. Some kind of operation that it's operating all year long, and when a new hire comes in, one of the very first things they do is to go spend whatever time in this classroom. But the conundrum is always the voters. You guys are spending too much money on your offices. Not realizing that we're trying to respond better to them, and that also points out the problem we have, that over time people built up these ideas about how inefficient we are and how mean we are.
If I may, it's not just Congress's responsibility here. The agency, as I put in my testimony, my local taxpayer advocates, when they knew there was a new constituent services person in a local office, we made it a point. They were required to go over to that office and meet with the new constituent services person to talk about how we do, what they need to do in order to get cases to us, the authorization that we need to get and how it needs to look. We didn't just expect the congressional offices who were busy and had tons of stuff to do to train their people on our processes. And I think that's something that the executive branch can do if they're more alert. They've got a role in constituent services. They're their taxpayers. And so we took that very seriously, and that can be reproduced and make it much easier. It wasn't a long conversation, but it was enormously helpful.
Thank you.
And may I jump in on that? As someone who was on the receiving end of their local taxpayer advocate service training, that was so unusual and so valuable. And I definitely agree, it's partly the agency's responsibility. There are two halves to casework training. There's how do you interact with constituents, as you said, Mr. Cleaver. There's, the kind of trauma-informed care, and how do I make you feel heard? How do I make you feel seen and appreciated? And then there's how do I actually solve your problem? And that's on the agency side. So I think a solid base on how do you interact with constituents and create that experience may be Congress's responsibility, but I definitely agree the agencies have a role to play as well. And some agencies do this, and there are knock-on effects, knock-on benefits for caseworkers on that first bucket as well. So I know the Army runs a regular conference, I believe it's every 2 years. USCIS runs a regular conference every few years, and those are enormously valuable, A, for training your caseworkers, but B, for bringing your caseworkers together in person to learn from each other. That's where I built some of the kind of peer mentorship relationships where, I was director of constituent services and a new director of constituent services and didn't know what to do, but I knew there was someone I had met from a regional office that I met at the Army conference, so I could give her a call and say, hey, I've got this weird case. Have you seen this before? So kind of the opportunity for caseworkers to learn from each other is also hugely valuable.
Thank you.
I've got like 5 questions, but let me try to boil them down a little bit. One of the things that had struck me, and maybe you can speak to whether this exists in Congress. If I had my predisposition, I mentioned, when I go through the airport, Clear sends me a text and I'm able to give them feedback on how it went. I would Yelpify the heck out of this place. Now, the challenge is in a political context, like there's practitioners of the dark arts who might use that tool for ill. But is there a way to do it? I mean, I'm just trying to think through, are there recommendations our committee could make that would make more standard feedback that can improve the performance of the institution when it comes to casework and constituent interaction?
Mr. Chairman, so absolutely. I think that the political realities being what they are, I don't necessarily know if you want to go full Yelpify for the gamification risk, but you have the ability to collect consumer experience metric, feedback metrics at the end of every transaction.
Yeah.
Some government agencies do this in a way that's almost comical, but I guess their heart's in the right place where they.
Does anyone do it well? Is there anyone we should look at?
Well, I tend to be of the perspective that you look to the private sector as Clear being an example, but as you indicate, at the end of every single transaction, even something I often think of, on receipts, at the bottom of a receipt, there'll be surveys that will say, we'll give you a gift certificate if you fill out a survey on your experience. And what that says is that the company is willing to pay people for their opinion about how well they're doing. In Congress, you don't typically have to pay people because they want to share their opinion with this institution. And so it's really about collecting that information in a structured way. And I think this is thematically the most important thing I could say on this topic is so much of that is ad hoc and actually creating those capabilities at an institutional level so it's not incumbent on an individual member office to both conceptualize and then implement a system like that. It should just be a standard CX package where at the end of every single, you could be as extreme as at the end of every single phone call, there's a quick audio survey. At the end of every email, there's a link. And again, I would look to the private sector for best practices.
Yeah.
In my Congress required the IRS back in 1998 to come up with balanced performance measures, not just look at quantitative, how many audits you did, et cetera, but also measure it balanced with employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction. So the IRS has a robust customer satisfaction survey process. In my organization, we would take representative samples and it would be down to the office. So we knew of those 75 offices, we could project results back to either the area or to the actual office of customer sat, and we would do it on a quarterly basis. And what I always found really interesting was we would ask a whole bunch of questions, but one of the questions that we asked particularly, and we didn't just do customer sat of the people who got results that they wanted. We also sent surveys to the taxpayers who we weren't able to assist for one reason or another. We didn't get the result they wanted. And in about 35% of the cases where taxpayers we couldn't get them the result they wanted, they still said that after their interaction with the Taxpayer Advocate Service, they felt better about the IRS as on a whole. And I think that goes, Congressman Cleaver, to your point about feelings, that they had somebody with the case advocate who actually listened to them, and they felt like the case advocate did what they could, and they were heard. And I think that kind of survey, of your constituents can show all sorts of really interesting stuff. And there are good examples in private sector about the questions that you ask, but also in some of the agencies, the questions to ask to get at more root issues about what's really going on with your relationship with your customers, your constituents, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I actually think your suggestion of having that become sort of standard practice makes a lot of sense. I don't know that individual offices can develop that on their own. So I think one of the things this committee could think about is does the institution create a module for your office where you could, use it or not? But I think there are some offices that would want to learn how they're performing and how to improve their performance. Along the lines of learning things from private industry, this may seem like a dog and cat kind of question, but when I order pizza, I can track when it gets put in the oven and when it is leaving the pizza joint and where it is on its way to my home. One of the most common interactions in a congressional office is people order flags, and there is no currently portal to track flags. This seems like something we could fix. Is that something that you think we ought to be thinking about? Is that something that would require, do you think it's a smarter thing to do institution-wide, House and Senate? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the flag pizza tracker would be just a small thing, but such a huge way to show trust and demonstrate transparency. This kind of comes back to where does innovation come from in Congress? I believe, and I apologize, I don't have specifics today, but I believe it may be Code for DC is working on a pilot project to figure out a workable sample for how to do a flag tracker. And that's fantastic. We really appreciate, I worked with Code for Boston, and when I was working with Congressman Moulton's office, it's amazing to kind of have the energy and the insight and the volunteer hours to educate Congress on how technology should work from these local civic tech groups. But it's interesting that the impetus for that and the work comes from an outside group rather than the impetus taken within Congress. I think that's kind of telling about where innovation is coming from in Congress today. But Matt may have more thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question, Chairman. One of my friends actually created the first pizza tracker, so I will be sure to send him this clip, and he'll be very excited. The powerful thing about the pizza tracker, which incidentally led to, when Domino's was the first to do it, and they led to 4 quarters of over 100% sales growth, like quarter over quarter, which is just remarkable sales growth. And there's a lot of components there, but one of the key issues is that transparency of the process, and it takes the uncertainty out of it. I was once stuck in in a snowstorm in the middle of the night in North Carolina on my way back to D.C., and the traffic came to a complete standstill at like 1 a.m. And it was obviously really frustrating. And then I heard over the radio that there was a power line down and the road was going to reopen at like 1:45 a.m. And even though I knew it was going to take 45 minutes for the highway to reopen, my comfort level immediately went up because the transparency over the process, brings comfort to any process, and the pizza tracker is emblematic of that. So I absolutely believe that even if it's going to take time, to your point earlier, Mr. Cleaver, even if the answer sometimes is no, the transparency over that process is going to build a lot of satisfaction. And so I think that the Congress, the House in particular, has, for some of the constituent services that are more transactional in nature, whether it's a tour request or a flag request, has the ability to build these sorts of platforms. And then again, not to go back to my same hobby horse, I would say that you could even build APIs to enable other people to build applications that show the same information in different formats. But it's an area of tremendous opportunity. And incidentally, would likely reduce the number of incoming call volumes following up on what is the status of my tour request or my flag request, or what it may be, which therefore means the remaining calls can be more efficiently handled at, again, higher value.
Let me ask one more, and then Vice Chair Timmons may have additional questions too. I know President Biden recently signed an executive order directing federal agencies to improve the customer experience and dealt specifically with what is referred to as the time tax, the undue burden that Americans face. And we've seen that with folks having to navigate confusing websites and fill out duplicate forms and often answering invasive and confusing questions, and just the time for someone who may often be in crisis if they're dealing with food insecurity or trying to get care for a loved one, and having to be their own advocate and having it take a lot of time. So as we look to improve constituent services in Congress, any thoughts on how we can ensure that our internal operations are not imposing a time tax on our constituents?
Sure, I'd love to jump in on that one. Yeah, absolutely. And I would just like to flag also, caseworkers have incredible expertise into that time tax. I mean, that is such a huge part of what we handle in casework is constituents who that time tax is not payable for one reason or another. They don't have the time. It's a crisis situation. So thank you for bringing that up. As far as what we can do to eliminate the time tax for constituents who work with congressional offices, the Privacy Act release form is a huge point. I know we talked earlier about the Cases Act and making sure that we're not chasing constituents over and over for different copies of the Privacy Act release form that have different information, because the agency won't take one that has a social security number on it, but it will take one with your alien number. There's a lot there that could be really streamlined if it was entirely digital. So that's a huge point. The other point that I'd like to raise, thinking back about our own casework operations, the biggest moment when we put a time tax on a constituent that I was uncomfortable with, or I wish we could have avoided, is when we had turnover in casework staff. So when, for one reason or another, whether it's staff turnover or we had to shuffle portfolios for one reason or another, we had to transfer a case between different caseworkers. And that was the point where no matter how good our handoff was, no matter how warm that handoff was, no matter how extensively the outgoing caseworker briefed the incoming caseworker, the constituent would have to explain things over again. They'd have to start from zero on building up trust with a new caseworker. So anything that Congress can do to improve staff retention for caseworkers would really eliminate that particular segment of time tax.
Excellent. Mr. Timmons.
Mr. Chairman, this has been great. I think we got a lot of meat that we're going to be able to make some recommendations on. I do not have any follow-up questions. Thank you.
We were just about to. Do you have a question? You sure? Okay. Did you have any other questions? Okay. I think this was terrific. I really appreciate the specificity of recommendations. You gave us a lot to run with, I think, and my hope is that our committee will be able to make some recommendations in this space. So I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony and also thank our committee members for their participation. As always, I want to thank our staff for pulling together such amazing witnesses and such a value-adding hearing, and to our stenographer for putting up with how fast we talk. And to the Armed Services Committee for letting us use their room. Thank you. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response.
I object.
I
I don't know if that's ever happened. What's that trigger, Emmanuel?
I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Here we go again. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
I couldn't ask my